Meredith did not leave a note. She had thought about it. Standing in the front room of the Cavendish house, with her father's leather satchel over one shoulder and the first pale light of March coming through the curtains, she had thought very specifically about what she would say, but every sentence she formed came out wrong. Too small, too large, too angry for someone who had decided that anger was not what she was feeling. What she was feeling was clarity. She had set the brooch on the mantelpiece, the one Marianne had pressed into her hand 14 months ago, with the particular warmth of a woman performing warmth for an audience. "Welcome to the family, my dear." Gold leaf, a small pearl at the center. Meredith had worn it to every dinner since, positioned at her collar the way a flag is positioned at a border. She picked it up. She turned it once in her fingers. She set it down, carefully with 2 fingers, square in the center, where it would be impossible to miss. The way she placed type, one piece at a time, in the right order, so that the thing it eventually said was true. Then she picked up the satchel and walked out the front door. The winter of 1853 had come in hard over Hartford, Connecticut. Ice on the river, ice on the rooftops, the kind of cold that found the gaps in a house and settled there. Meredith Sterne had spent that winter working in her father's print shop on Arbor Street, setting type by lamplight while her father coughed in the back room and refused to see it for what it was. She was 26 years old. Bernard Sterne had been the best typographer in Hartford County and had spent 40 years building a shop that printed church pamphlets and local circulars, and twice a year, a literary journal that 17 people subscribed to and that he considered his finest work. He had also left behind, when he died in February of 1854, 3 outstanding debts and a lease that came due in April. Meredith had the skills. She had learned typesetting at 8 and layout at 12 and had been running half the shop's operations since she was 20. What she did not have was capital, or a name that meant anything to the men who held the notes on the building. Felix Cavendish had a name. He had capital. He had a family that had been in Hartford commerce for 3 generations and a mother who believed, with the focused conviction of a woman who had run out of other projects, that Felix needed to marry before 35, and that Meredith Sterne, for all her inconvenient competence, was at least sensible enough not to require managing. Meredith had told herself she could live with the terms. The debts were cleared. The shop was sold. Marianne had been clear that it needed to go. But the tools were hers. Her father's compositing sticks, his leading gauge, 2 cases of type he had spent years assembling. She kept them in the back room of the Cavendish house, in a cedar chest that no one asked about, and that she opened, sometimes on quiet afternoons, to run her fingers over the letters, in the particular way a person touches something that reminds them of who they were before they started making compromises. Felix was not unkind. She needed to be clear about that, even to herself. He was courteous, attentive in the measured way of a man who had been taught that a well-managed household ran on small gestures. The chair pulled out, the evening inquiry after her day, the careful listening that looked like listening right up, until the moment she said something he had not anticipated, and then stopped being listening and became instead the patient expression of a man waiting for the conversation to return to familiar ground. He had never once asked her about the cedar chest. In 14 months he had not asked. The night it happened, she had not intended to overhear anything. The Cavendish house had a study at the back of the ground floor, and on cold evenings Felix worked there after dinner, while Marianne held her usual court in the front parlor, and Meredith did whatever Meredith did, which, Marianne had once noted to a visitor, with the precision of a woman making a point, seems to vary. On this particular evening in late January, Meredith had gone downstairs for her shawl, which she had left on the chair by the hall window. The study door was slightly open. She heard her own name before she had a chance not to. "Cannot go on ignoring the Whitfield inquiry forever," Marianne was saying. The voice of a woman whose patience had a very specific weight to it. "Roland Whitfield's daughter will not wait. I am aware of the Whitfield family." Felix's voice, even. The voice he used when he had already decided something, and was waiting for the conversation to confirm it. "Then you understand the opportunity. A connection to Whitfield's firm would position this family considerably better than." "Mother." "I am asking directly, Felix." A pause, briefer than the one Meredith would have expected. "Did you intend this to be a marriage or an arrangement? Because there is a difference in how each one is managed going forward." Silence. Not the silence of a man searching for words. The silence of a man who had already found them and was deciding how honest to be. She manages the house well, Felix said. She's intelligent. She doesn't make unreasonable demands. Another pause. She is adequate, mother, as a wife. She is adequate. Adequate. Meredith did not move. She stood in the hallway, with her hand an inch from the doorframe, and felt the word settle into her the way cold settles into a room. Not all at once, but through every gap that had been left open. That is not what I asked, Marianne said. No, Felix said, I suppose it isn't. Do you love her? The silence this time was 4 seconds. Meredith counted them the way she set type, one piece at a time, knowing what they would spell when they were done. No, Felix said. Not cruelly. That was the thing she would carry longest, the particular quality of how he said it. Not cruel, not cold, simply honest in the way a man is honest when he believes no one who matters is listening. I don't believe what you're describing was ever part of the arrangement. Marianne made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite regret. She understood what she was entering, Felix said. She is a practical woman. Yes, Marianne said, that is precisely what I am concerned about. Meredith walked back upstairs, slowly, her hand on the banister, not because she needed the support, but because she had learned a long time ago, at her father's knee, that haste in the shop meant errors, and errors in print were permanent. She sat on the edge of the bed. She waited for grief to arrive. What arrived instead was something quieter and more useful. She was not surprised. She had known on some level, had always known. In the way you know a thing when the evidence has been accumulating for months, and you have been choosing, deliberately, not to add it up. She saw it now. She had walked into this arrangement with her eyes mostly open, and had then spent 14 months once closing them a little more each day, convincing herself that usefulness was enough, that competence could substitute for regard, that a man who remembered to ask after her health was the same as a man who actually cared what the answer was. He was not. There was a difference. She understood it completely now, sitting on the edge of that bed in the January dark. She had been adequate long enough. She stood up and went to the wardrobe. She did not pack everything. There was no point in everything. What she packed was hers. What had been hers before she brought it into this house, under the assumption that it was contributing to a life, when in fact it had been contributing to an arrangement. Her father's compositing sticks, his leather-bound workbook, 40 years of typesetting notes in his cramped, precise hand, a small packet of letters from a printer in Philadelphia named Erasmus Bell, her father's oldest professional contact, a man who had written to her 6 weeks after the funeral, before the marriage, before any of it, a short letter that said only, "Your father told me you could set a full page in the time it took most men to find the right case. If you ever need work, there is work. E. Bell." She had kept that letter in the bottom of the cedar chest beneath her father's workbook, folded small. The way you fold something you are not certain you will need, but cannot bring yourself to throw away. She needed it now. She unfolded it, she read it once, she put it in her coat pocket. Then she crossed to the mantelpiece, and set the brooch down, and did not look at it again. She did not write a note. There was nothing she wanted to say that paper could hold without making it smaller than it was. She picked up the satchel, she walked out. The Philadelphia coach left from the Crown Street depot at 4:30 in the morning. Meredith had known this because she had asked 3 weeks ago, standing in the depot on the pretext of mailing a parcel, asking the schedule clerk in the specific tone of a woman who is gathering information without letting on why. She walked the 6 blocks in the dark. Her breath fogged in the cold. Somewhere behind her the Cavendish house sat still, and quiet with a brooch on the mantelpiece and a cedar chest no longer in the back room. She did not look back. The only other passenger on the early coach was a woman of perhaps 60 traveling with a small dog and a quantity of luggage that suggested she had not decided how long she was staying wherever she was going. She glanced at Meredith's single bag and said nothing, which Meredith appreciated. For the first hour she watched Connecticut give way to the dark. After that she allowed herself to feel it. Not grief exactly, and not relief exactly, but the particular sensation of a thing you have been carrying for a long time and have finally set down, and your body has not yet understood that the weight is gone, and you are still braced for it. She had tried. That was the part that asked to be felt. She had brought everything she had into that house, her skills, her attention, her careful management of every room and every interaction, and had been in the end adequate, not seen, not known, adequate. She let herself feel it for the duration of one county. Then she folded it away the same way she had set the brooch, precisely, deliberately, with both hands. There was work to do. Erasmus Bell was smaller than his letters. He was perhaps 72, with ink-stained fingers that he had apparently given up trying to clean sometime in the previous decade, and a print shop on Locust Street that smelled, wonderfully and specifically, of linseed oil and paper, and the particular metallic tang of fresh type that Meredith had grown up breathing. He looked at her for a long moment when she appeared in his doorway. "You look like your father," he said. "People say that," she said. "It's not an insult." "No," he said, "it isn't. Come in and tell me how bad it actually is." She told him. Not all of it, not the study, not the 4 seconds of silence, but enough. The debts, the marriage, the departure. Belle listened the way her father had listened to problem jobs, without interruption, already thinking 3 steps ahead. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Can you still set type?" he said. "I could set type before I could properly read it," she said. "Different question," he said. "Can you still do it the way you used to, before you spent 1.5 years running someone else's household?" She picked up a compositing stick from the bench beside her. She set 6 lines of 12-point Castellan in the time it took him to drink half his coffee. He looked at the result. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "There's a room above the shop. It needs some work. The pay is modest until the shop's accounts improve. You start Monday." She had started that Saturday. She had not been able to help herself. Back in Hartford, Felix came downstairs at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and found the brooch. He stood looking at it for a moment. Then he called for Mrs. Hadley, who had found the room already empty when she went to bring the morning water. The wardrobe open, the cedar chest gone, no note. He picked up the brooch. It was lighter than he expected. He was not, at root, a man who examined himself. He had been adequately comfortable for long enough that self-examination had never seemed strictly necessary. Meredith's absence forced something open in him that comfort had kept closed. He started noticing things he had not noticed before. The way the evening meals, which Mrs. Hadley managed capably, no longer had the specific quiet excellence that Meredith had somehow produced without ever drawing attention to it. The evenings, which had previously had a shape he had taken entirely for granted, and which now simply ended without ceremony. He had not known he was comfortable. He had only known he was no longer. It was his sister who found out where Meredith had gone. Kit Cavendish was 12 years old, with the particular quality of attention that some children develop when they have learned that adults underestimate them. She had adored Meredith from the second afternoon of their acquaintance, when Meredith had sat with her at the kitchen table and walked her through the entire process of hand-setting a line of type, explaining each step without dissension, treating Kit's questions as though they were interesting rather than inconvenient. Most adults treated Kit's questions as things to be redirected. It had taken her 2 weeks and 1 carefully worded letter to her father's old secretary, who had managed the correspondence around the marriage, and who, it turned out, was more forthcoming with a 12-year-old than he had any reason to expect, to find it. Erasmus Bell's shop on Locust Street, Philadelphia. Kit wrote to Meredith immediately. The letters that came back were the best thing in her life for the following 6 months. Meredith wrote about the shop, the smell of it, the steady accumulation of accounts as word spread, that Bell's Press had someone who could handle detail work that other shops wouldn't attempt. She wrote about a woman who came in to have her late husband's sermons bound, and stayed 2 hours because she had no one to talk to, and Meredith had thought to ask how she was doing. She wrote about her father's hands and what they had taught her. She did not write about Felix. Kit wrote about the birds she was cataloging from the back garden. She had started this the previous autumn when Meredith had given her a blank journal and suggested she keep one. She wrote, once, very carefully, "Felix asks about you. He doesn't ask me directly. He asks what I'm reading and then looks at the envelopes on my desk. He can see the Philadelphia postmark. He hasn't said anything." Meredith did not respond to that paragraph. She responded to the birds. It was March. 1 year exactly since Meredith had walked out the front door. When Kit appeared in the doorway of Felix's study with 4 of Meredith's letters in her hand and the particular expression of a 12-year-old who has decided that clarity is more useful than tact, she laid the letters on his desk without preamble. He looked at them, at his sister. "You've been corresponding," he said. "Yes." Kit stood very still, her hands folded in front of her the way she did when she was concentrating. "She's been running half the operations of Bell's Press since October. He's talking about putting her name on the letterhead. Felix looked at the envelopes. The Philadelphia postmark. The handwriting he recognized, careful and specific, the exact quality of attention she brought to everything she touched. "Kit," he said. "You know what you said. Not an accusation. A statement, delivered with the flat precision of a child who has decided that the true thing, said plainly, does the most good. She heard you say it. She told me. Not to make you feel guilty, that's not why she told me. She told me because she said she has always preferred truths to comfortable ones, and silence felt like a kind of lie." Felix was quiet. "You could write to her," Kit said. "I don't know what to say." That, Kit said, with the full authority of 12 years of observation, is not an adequate reason. She left the letters on his desk. She left the room. He sat with that word for a long time after she was gone. Adequate. It was the first time he had heard it come back at him from the outside, and it sounded, from this angle, entirely different than it had the night he had said it. He had meant it as a neutral accounting, a practical assessment. He understood now, sitting at the desk with the letters in front of him, and his sister's footsteps fading down the hall, that there was no neutral accounting of a person. That adequate, applied to a human being, was not a measurement. It was a verdict. Wrote 4 drafts, before he set them all aside, and started a 5th, with the decision that he was going to stop trying to sound like the right version of himself, and simply say the true thing. The letter arrived at Bell's Press on a Wednesday morning. Meredith found it when she came up from the press room, with ink on her left hand and the proof of a commemorative booklet she had spent the previous day setting. She stood at the work table and read it without sitting down. It was not eloquent. She noticed that immediately and found it more affecting for being ineloquent. The sentences that stopped and started, the one long paragraph that clearly went through several attempts at the right word before settling on a simpler one. He said he understood now what she had heard. He said he had not known, at the time he said it, that he was wrong, not because he believed it was right, but because he had not been paying enough attention to the difference. He said that was itself the failure. He said he was not writing to ask her to return. He was writing because his sister had told him that Meredith had always preferred uncomfortable truths, and he had been offering comfortable silence for a year, and he was finished with it. The last line said, "I would be grateful to know that you are well. That is all I am asking. You owe me nothing, I am aware of that." She read the letter twice. She folded it. She went back to work. That evening she wrote a reply. She told him she was well. She told him the shop suited her. She used the word suited the way she would describe a good fit of type to column. Accurate, neither warm nor cold. She did not tell him that his acknowledgement had loosened something in her chest that she had not fully realized was still knotted. She folded the letter and set it in the outgoing post. Then she sat for a while longer and thought about what she had not written. The Philadelphia Printers and Publishers Association held its annual spring dinner in April at the Assembly Rooms on Chestnut Street. It was the kind of gathering that mattered in this industry. The people in that room represented most of the significant presses from Boston to Baltimore, and the evening's announcements carried weight. Felix had business in Philadelphia. He wrote that he would be in the city. Meredith went with Belle, as she had the previous year, seated at the small press table near the far wall. She wore a dark green dress she had made herself in the evenings over the previous month, and kept her hands folded on the table because the ink staining on her left forefinger was not entirely out, and she had decided not to be concerned about it. She saw Felix across the room within the first 10 minutes. He was speaking to a paper merchant she recognized, conducting himself with the surface ease of a man who knew this territory. He did not look toward her table. She did not look at him again until the formal portion of the evening. The association president, a heavy-set man named Chadwick, rose to make the announcements. 2 new partnerships. 1 retirement. Then he looked toward the Hartford contingent with the anticipatory expression of a man expecting something he had been told was forthcoming. Felix stood. The room settled. "I had intended this evening to serve as the occasion for a business announcement," he said. His voice carried without effort. "I find I need to make a different one first." The silence was complete. There is a printer working in this city, at Bell's Press on Locust Street, whose name is not as widely known in this room as it should be. Her name is Meredith Sterne. Some of you knew her father. He paused. She came to Philadelphia because she left a situation in which she had been told, by someone who should have known better, that she was adequate. She was not invited to weigh in on that assessment. She simply heard it said and acted accordingly. Meredith did not move. That person was me, Felix said, and I am saying publicly, in this room, that I was wrong, not about what I felt at the time I said it, but about what I failed to understand, which was that there is a difference between a practical arrangement and a partnership, and that I had offered the first while accepting the benefits of the second, and that the woman I had called adequate was running half of everything I owned, while I was occupied with failing to see her. He was not looking at her table. She noticed that. He was saying this to the room, not to her, not as a performance for her benefit. Bell's press has contracted 4 new accounts this year that Mr. Bell has credited directly to her work, Felix said. I think her name belongs on the letterhead. I think it belongs on the work itself. And I think it is past time that the people in this room who give out contracts knew who they were giving them to. He sat down. Bell leaned toward Meredith from his chair. Well, he said quietly, looking at the room with the expression of a man who had just seen a long game reach its conclusion. Your father would have had something to say about that. He would have said it was overdue, Meredith said. Yes, Bell said, he would. She found Felix in the hallway afterward, near the side entrance, where the cold air came in from the street and the noise of the room was muffled. He was alone. He turned when he heard her step, and then stood very still, the way a person stands who has said the difficult thing and is now waiting to understand what it costs. You didn't look at me, she said, when you were speaking. No. Why not? Because it wasn't for you, he said. I told you that, in the letter. I meant it. If it had been a performance for your benefit, it would have been worth less. The room needed to hear it. I needed to say it somewhere. You couldn't tell me to stop. She looked at him for a moment. That was not a small thing you did, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. He met her gaze directly. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I want to be clear about that. I know what you're building in Philadelphia, and I know you didn't build it waiting for me, and I'm not here to imply that you should have been. She said nothing. I would like a chance to demonstrate something, he said. Not tonight. Not in a hallway after a dinner where I just said your name in front of 200 people. He stopped, reorganized. Over time, by actions. That is all I am asking. The hallway was quiet, street noise outside, muffled by the walls. The evidence, she said, is better than it was. He waited. It is not yet sufficient, she said. I want you to understand that. I am a woman who has built a life she is not willing to trade for a promise. Any future I consider has to fit around that life. It cannot ask me to diminish it. Yes, he said, without hesitation, and she noted the absence of hesitation. My name goes on the letterhead, she said. Bell has already agreed. That does not change. It wouldn't occur to me to ask it to change, he said. And I am not moving back to Hartford. He was quiet for a moment. I have been considering, he said, that Hartford is not the only city that has use for what I do. Whitfield's firm has a Philadelphia office. A pause. I am not saying this to win something. I am saying it because it is true, and because you asked me once to prefer uncomfortable truths. This is an uncomfortable truth. I would rather be in a city where you are than in a city where you are not. She looked at him. At this man, who had spent months becoming something she had not been given evidence to expect, and who had said the hard thing in front of a room full of people, and then not looked at her while saying it, because he understood the difference between honesty and performance. The evidence was better. She had to be precise about that. A chance, she said, demonstrated over time, by actions not announcements. Yes. I watch everything, Felix. I want you to know that. I know, he said. I'm counting on it. He came to Philadelphia in June with a letter of introduction to Whitfield's associate on Walnut Street and a careful absence of fanfare. He found a room 3 blocks from the press. He did not announce himself at the shop. He waited until Kit wrote to Meredith. Kit, who had moved her correspondence to weekly now that things were developing. And Meredith wrote back to Kit, and then, on a separate sheet, a single line to Felix. Bell needs a new press-on contract. He's been refusing the obvious quote for 2 months because he thinks he can negotiate better. He can't. If you know anyone in the iron casting trade, it would be useful to know by Thursday. He replied Thursday morning with a name, a reference, and a specific number he had confirmed was below Bell's threshold. She had expected something. She had not expected something useful. The letters became different after that, more direct. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone, about a proof that had gone wrong 3 times, before she found the stuck sort on the third pass, about a customer who had cried over the printing of her mother's recipe collection, because it was the first thing she had made for herself in 30 years. About the morning she had opened the shop alone and stood in the doorway with the smell of ink and cold paper, and understood that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He told her about learning things. About the Whitfield account and what he had gotten wrong in the first meeting, and the specific conversation afterward in which he had, for the first time, said plainly, "I think I made an error. Tell me what I should do differently." He told her it had been harder than anything he had done in years, and that the result had been better than any alternative. She wrote back, "That's the only way it works." He wrote back, "I'm starting to understand that." It was Kit who pushed things forward, in the way Kit always did, with the uncluttered logic of someone who does not have time for adults taking too long. She appeared in Philadelphia in September, on the occasion of a supposed visit to a school friend, which lasted exactly one afternoon before she turned up at the press with her bird journal under her arm, and the expression of someone who has arranged something and is satisfied with the arrangement. She stayed a week. She and Meredith spent 2 mornings at the work table, Kit learning to set type with the quick hands that apparently ran in families, asking questions that Meredith answered directly, as if they were worth the time, because they were. On the last morning, Kit looked up from the compositing stick and said without preamble, "Are you going to let him try?" Meredith said a line of type, "I already am." "For real, I mean," Kit said. "Not just the practical things, the rest of it." Meredith looked at her. At this 12-year-old who had catalogued 47 bird species, and confronted her brother with 4 letters, and traveled to Philadelphia on a pretext that fooled no one, and had been, in every essential way, more honest than any adult in the surrounding situation. "Yes," Meredith said, "I believe I am." Kit nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone whose planning had paid out, and went back to the type. There was no ceremony. That was what she had wanted. Nothing that looked like the beginning of an arrangement. Nothing that could be confused with the last time. What there was in October, in the back room of Bell's Press after the last customer had gone, and the accounts were settled and the smell of fresh ink hung in the cool evening air, was Felix sitting across the work table from her, with the proof of the new letterhead between them. Bell and Sterne Printers, Locust Street, Philadelphia. She had looked at it for a long time. "Well?" she said. "Yes," he said. The next morning, he arrived at the shop at 7. He had started doing this in September, not to help, not to observe, but because he had asked what time she began, and she had told him, and he had decided without making a production of it that 7 was not an unreasonable hour. He made the coffee. He had learned how she took it the same way he had learned everything recently, by paying attention instead of waiting to be told. He brought it through to the press room and set it on the shelf beside her proof copy, without saying anything. She glanced up. She glanced at the cup. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. He went back to the front room. He had his own correspondence to manage, and he had established the habit of working at the small table by the window, where the morning light was good, and he was close enough to hear the press when it was running, which he had found, to his own considerable surprise, to be a sound he did not want to be without. At 8 o'clock, the first customer knocked. Meredith came through from the press room, wiping her hands on her apron, and opened the door and asked what they needed, and listened to the answer with her full attention. The kind that went underneath the surface and found what the person was actually asking for, which was sometimes not the same thing as what they had said. Felix heard her voice through the wall. He picked up his pen. Outside, Philadelphia was already in motion, and in the press on Locust Street the work was running, and the type was set, and the door was open, and Meredith Sterne was exactly where she had chosen to be, on every term she had ever required, in a life she had built with her own 2 ink-stained hands.